The Fat of the Land by Wilhelmir Stephenson. Chapter 4. The Laboratory Check. Disclaimer. This chapter had a lot of typos, so I might make some mistakes. And if you're going to buy this book, this is the only edition you can find, I think. Don't buy this edition unless you have a lot of patience for typos. You might want to just buy you might want to just download the PDF. Just Google Fat of the Land PDF. You'll find it. Okay. The Laboratory Check. Now that the conclusions of the experiments in diet which Karsten Andersen and I undertook at Bellevue Hospital have been accepted by the medical world, it is difficult to realize that there could have been such a storm of excitement about an announcement of the plan, such a violent clash of opinion, such near unanimity in the prediction of dire results. The feeling that decisive controlled tests were needed began to spread after I told one of the scientific heads of the Food Administration in 1918 that I had lived for an aggregate of more than 5 years, with enjoyment, on just meat and water. A turning point came in 1920, when I had an hour for explaining a meat regimen to the physicians and staff of the Mayo Clinic. The concluding phase began in 1928, when Mr. Andersen and I entered the dietetic ward of Bellevue Hospital to give modern science what appeared to have been the first chance in its history to observe human subjects while they lived through the chill of winter and the heat of summer for 12 months on an exclusive meat diet. We were to do it under conditions of ordinary city life. At the beginning of our northern work in 1906, as was said a few pages back, it was the accepted view among doctors and dietitians that man cannot live on meat alone. They believed specifically that a group of serious diseases were either caused directly by meat or preventable only by vegetables. Those views were still being held when, in the autumn of 1918, an old friend, Frederick C. Walcott, later Senator of Connecticut, decided that my experiences and the resulting opinions were revolutionary in certain fields, and introduced me to Professor Raymond Pearl of Johns Hopkins, who was then with the United States Food Administration in Washington. Pearl considered several of the things I told him upsetting to views then held. He questioned me before a stenographer and sent the mimeographed results to a number of dietitians. Their replies varied from concurrence with him to agreement with David Hume that you are more likely to encounter 1,000 liars than one miracle. Pearl was convinced that neither fibs nor miracles were involved, and proposed that we write together a book on dietetics. I agreed. But cares intervened and things dragged. In 1920, I had the above-mentioned chance to speak at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. One of the Mayo brothers suggested that I spend 2 or 3 weeks there to have a check-over and see whether they could not find somewhere in my carcass evidence of the supposed bad effects of meat. I wanted to do this, but commitments in New York prevented. Then one day, in the hearing of the gastroenterologist Dr. Clarence W. Lieb, I told of my regret that I had not been able to take advantage of the Mayo checkover. Lieb spoke up, saying that there were good doctors in New York, too, and volunteered to gather a committee of specialists who would put me through an examination as rigid as anything I could get from the Mayos. The committee was organized. I went through the mill, and Lieb reported the findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association for July 1926. The effects of an exclusive, long-continued meat diet. The committee had failed to discover any trace of even one of the supposed harmful effects. With this publication, the Lieb and Pearl events merge. For when the American Meat Institute wrote asking permission to reprint a large number of copies for distribution to the medical profession and to dietitians, Lieb, Pearl, and I went into a huddle. The result was a letter to the Institute saying that we refused permission to reprint, but suggesting that they might get something much better worth publishing, and with right to publish it, if they placed an adequate fund at the disposal of a research institution for a series of experiments designed to check, under conditions of average city life, the problems which had arisen out of my experiences and views. For it was contended by many that an all-meat diet might work in a cold climate, though not in a warm, and under the strenuous conditions of the frontier, though not in common American sedentary business life. We gave warning that, if anything, the institution chosen would lean backwards to make sure that nothing in the results could even be suspected of having been influenced by the source of the money. After long negotiation, the Institute agreed to furnish the necessary funds. The research organization selected for conducting the tests was the Russell Sage Institute of Pathology, which was housed in Bellevue Hospital and was then, as now, affiliated with the Medical College of Cornell University. The committee in charge consisted of leaders in the most important sciences that appeared related to the problem, and represented 7 institutions. The American Meat Institute, Dr. C. Robert Moulton. American Museum of Natural History, Dr. Clark Whistler. Cornell University Medical College, Dr. Walter L. Niles. Harvard University, Drs. Lawrence Henderson, Ernest Houghton, and Percy Howe. Johns Hopkins University, Drs. William McGallum and Raymond Pearl. Russell Sage Institute of Pathology, Eugene Dubois and Graham Lusk. University of Chicago, Dr. Edwin Jordan, and unattached, Dr. Clarence Lieb, private practice, and, of course, myself, Wilhelmir Stephenson. The clinical supervision was in charge of Dr. Lieb. More like Dr. Lieb was in charge of clinical supervision. After meetings of the supervising committee, the election of a smaller executive committee, and much discussion, it was decided that, while the experiment would be directed at strictly scientific problems, there might be side glances, now and then, toward common folk beliefs and the propaganda of certain groups. For instance, our definition of a meat diet as a diet from which all vegetable elements are excluded would logically permit us to use milk and eggs, for they are not vegetables. But some vegetarians are illogical enough to allow milk and eggs. We agreed to be correspondingly illogical and exclude them. This forestalled the possible cry that we were being saved by the eggs and milk from the ill effects of a diet that excluded vegetables. The aim of the project was not, as the press claimed at the time, to prove something or other. We were not trying to prove or disprove anything. We merely wanted to get at the facts. Every aspect of the results would be studied, but special attention would be paid to certain common views, such as that scurvy will result from the absence of vegetable elements, that other deficiency diseases may be produced, that the effect on the circulatory system and on the kidneys will be bad, that certain harmful microorganisms will flourish in the intestinal tract, and that there will be insufficient minerals, in particular calcium. The broad question was, of course, the effect upon the general health, as judged by the observations of the supervising doctors and by the testimony of the subjects themselves. The test was originally planned for me alone, but I might get run over by a truck, and that would be construed, by mixed dieters and vegetarians, as showing impairment of mental alertness and bodily vigor through the monotony and poison of meat. It was difficult to find me a colleague, for the sort of test we planned cannot be made on just anybody. That appears if 2 elementary cases are considered. Assume that the news of a ruinous stock market crash is conveyed to a number of victims after they have eaten a good meal. Digestion may stop almost at the point of the mental shock. Obviously, the sickness which follows that meal should not be construed as a reflection upon the quality of the food. Or ask some impressionable friends to dine. Serve them veal, of good quality and well cooked. When dinner is over, you inquire about the veal. they will answer with the usual compliments. Then you say that your case has been proved. Rover died, and they have eaten him. If the stage setting and acting have been adequate, some at least of the company will make a dive from the room. What has sickened them is not the meat of a dog, but the idea that they have eaten a dog. The Russell Sage experiment, then, could not be made upon anybody controlled by strong dietetic beliefs, such as that meat is harmful, that abstinence from vegetables brings trouble, that one tires of a food if he has to eat the same thing often. But almost anyone holds these or similar beliefs. So we were practically compelled to choose subjects from members of one of my expeditions. They were the only living Europeans we knew who had used exclusive meat long enough to eliminate completely the mental hazards. One man, fortunately, was available. He was Karsten Andersen, a young Danish man who had been a member of my third expedition. During that time he had lived an aggregate of more than a year on strictly meat and water, suffering no ill result, and, in fact, being on one occasion cured by an exclusive meat regimen from scurvy, which he had contracted on a mixed diet. Moreover, he knew from the experience of a dozen of his colleagues on the expedition that his healthful enjoyment of the exclusive meat diet was not peculiar to himself, but common to all those who had tried it, including members of 3 races. As has been said, ordinary whites, Cape Verde Islanders, and South Sea Islanders. But there were other things which made Andersen particularly suitable. Through several years he had been working his own Florida orange grove, spending most of practically every day outdoors, lightly clad and enjoying the benefits, such as they are, of subtropical sunlight. In that mental and physical environment he had naturally been on a diet heavy in vegetable elements and had suffered constantly from head colds. His hair was thinning steadily, and he had developed a condition involving intestinal toxemia, and as would ordinarily cause a doctor to look serious and pronounce, "You must go light on meat," or, "I am afraid you'll have to cut out meat entirely." We could find no one but Andersen whose mind would leave his body unhandicapped. So, in January of 1928, the test began with the 2 of us. It was under the direct charge of Dr. Dubois and his staff in the dietetic ward of Bellevue Hospital in New York City. A storm of protests from friends broke upon us when the press announced that we were entering Bellevue. These were based mainly upon the newspaper report that we were going to eat our meat raw, and the belief that we were using lean meat exclusively. The first was just a false rumor. The trouble under the second head was linguistic. Eating meat raw, our friends chorused, would make us social outcasts. It is proper to serve oysters raw and clams in the United States, herring raw in Norway, several kinds of fish raw in Japan, and beef raw almost anywhere in the world if only you change the name and call it rare. The fashion of giving raw meat to infants was spreading, but we were babies neither in years nor stature, and could not take advantage of that dispensation. The answer to the raw meat scare was an explanation of a basic procedure of our test. Andersen and I were to select our food by palate, so long as it was meat, and we were to decide for ourselves how far each meal was to be cooked. It proved that usually he leaned to medium cooking, and I to well done. The linguistic trouble came from a recent change of American usage. In Elizabethan English, meat was any kind of food, as in the expression meat and drink. In modern England, this has narrowed down to what is implied in the rhyme about Jack Sprat eating no fat and his wife no lean, although they both ate meat. In the United States, meat, in the last few years, has become a synonym for lean. The meaning can become even narrower, as when somebody, usually a woman, tells you that she is strictly forbidden by her physician to touch meat, but that she is permitted all the chicken she wants, with an occasional lamb chop. To that woman, meat signifies lean beef. Linguistically, then, we pacified our friends by references to Mr. and Mrs. Sprat. Our diet would be of meat in the English sense. we were just going to live under modern conditions on the food of our more or less remote ancestors. The food, too, of certain contemporary primitive hunters. During our first 3 weeks in Bellevue Hospital, we were fed measured quantities of what might be called a standard mixed diet. Fruits, cereals, bacon, and eggs. That sort of thing for breakfast. Meats, vegetables, including fruits, for lunch and dinner. During this time, various specialists examined us from practically every angle that seemed pertinent. Most tedious, and let us hope correspondingly valuable, were the calorimeter studies. With no food since the evening before, we would go in the late morning to the calorimeter room and sit quiet for an hour to get over the physiological effect of having perhaps walked up a single flight of stairs. Then we slid into calorimeters, which were like big coffins with glass sides, and everybody waited around an hour or so until we were over the disturbance of having gotten in. The box was now closed up, and for 3 hours we lay there as nearly motionless as we could well be, while a corps of scientists, visible through the glass, puttered about and studied our physiological processes. We were not allowed to read. We were cautioned against even thinking about anything particularly pleasant or particularly disagreeable, for thoughts and feelings heat or cool you, speed things up or slow them down, play hob generally with normal processes. Dr. Dubois told of a calorimeter test ruined by a mental disturbance. A nervous Romanian had developed an intense dislike for a fellow patient named Kelly. During the second hour of an experiment that had been going very well, Max caught a glimpse of the hated Kelly through the window. This raised his metabolism 10% during that whole hour. With the air we breathed and the rest of our intakes and excretions carefully analyzed, with our blood chemistry determined, and a check on such things as the billions of living bacteria which inhabit the human intestinal tract, we were ready for the meat. During the 3 weeks of the Bellevue mixed diet and preliminary checkup, we had been free to come and go. Now we were placed under lock and key. Neither of us was permitted, at any time, day or night, to be out of sight of a doctor or a nurse. This was in part the ordinary rigidity of a controlled scientific experiment, but it was in some part a bow to the skepticism of the mixed diet advocates and to the emotional storms which were sweeping the vegetarian realms. Nor was the skepticism and excitement all newspaper talk. One of the leading European authorities, Dr. M. Hindhead, was touring the United States. He called on us during the preliminary 3 weeks and assured the presiding physicians most solemnly that we should be unable to go more than 4 or 5 days on meat. He had tried it out himself on experimental human subjects, who usually broke down in about 3 days. The breakdowns, I thought, were of psychological antecedents, but Dr. Hindhead insisted that they were strictly physiological, quite independent of the emotions. This European did take an extreme position, but many American nutritionists and physiologists were like-minded. One of the most distinguished, Dr. Francis Gano Benedict, director of the Nutrition Laboratory of the Carnegie Institution, gave an outside of 3 weeks before the test would have to cease. It was he, in fact, who had written Dr. Pearl, "It was easier to believe that I and all the members of our expedition were lying than to concede that we had remained in good health for several years on an exclusive meat regimen." The experiment started smoothly with Anderson, who was permitted to eat in such quantity as he liked, such things as he liked, provided only that they came under our definition of meat. In my case, there was a hitch, in a way foreseen, for I had published in 1913, on pages 140 to 142 of My Life with the Eskimo, an account of how some natives and I became ill when we were forced to go 2 or 3 weeks on lean meat. So I forecast trouble when Dubois suggested that I start the test by eating as large of quantities as I possibly could of chopped, fatless muscle. But he countered by citing my own experience where illness had not come until after more than a week, and he now proposed lean for only 2 or 3 days. So I gave in. The chief purpose of placing me abruptly on exclusively lean meat was that there would be a sharp contrast with Anderson, who was going to be on a normal meat diet, consisting of such proportions of lean and fat as his own taste determined. In the Arctic, we had become ill during the second or third fatless week. I now became ill on the second day. The time difference between Bellevue and the Arctic was due, no doubt, mainly to the existence of a little fat, here and there, in our northern caribou. We had eaten the tissue from behind the eyes, we had broken the bones for marrow, and in doing everything we could to get fat, we had evidently secured more than we realized. At Bellevue, the meat, carefully scrutinized, was as lean as such muscle tissue well can be. Then, in the Arctic, we had eaten tendons and other indigestible matter. We had chewed the soft ends of bones, getting a deal of bulk that way when we were trying to secure the fat. What we ate at Bellevue contained no bulk material of this kind, so that my stomach could be compelled to hold a much larger amount of lean. Moreover, I had in New York a much larger stomach than in the Arctic. There it had been constricted in accord with the small bulk of a lean-fat diet. Here, in civilization, it had been expanded through the needs of a bulky mixed diet. The symptoms brought on at Bellevue by an incomplete meat diet, this ration of lean without fat, were exactly the same as in the Arctic, except that they came on faster: diarrhea and a feeling of general baffling discomfort. Up north, the Eskimos and I had been cured immediately when we got some fat. Dr. Dubois now cured me the same way, by giving me fat sirloin steaks, brains fried in bacon fat, and things of that sort. In 2 or 3 days I was all right, but I had lost considerable weight. A second upset was a result of the first, and a result of carelessness. As has been said, my cure from the lean meat difficulty was in part the eating of brains fried in bacon fat. The brains tasted delicious, partly, no doubt, on their own merits, but also partly on account of the bacon fat through which we were compensating for the previous excess of lean. So I ate too much. This produced a mild indigestion with attendant discomforts, and reminded me that the only recurrent digestive upsets I had had on our exclusive meat up north were those produced by eating large meals which contained too high a percentage of fat, which was most likely to occur just after we had been living on meat that was too lean. There is no tendency to overeat fat if you have fat every day, not necessarily at every meal. But there is danger of it after a shortage of fat. So far as memory serves and my records go, there is no corresponding tendency to overeat of lean to an injurious extent after one has been on an excessively fat regimen. If the diet has been too lean, one is likely to overindulge in fat to a degree which causes vomiting within the next hour or two. This single gorging and its violent reaction apparently leave no bad effect, but a persistent overindulgence can produce discomforts and difficulties that may last a day or even several days. The best practice, in such cases, would seem to be eating for 2 or 3 meals somewhat less than the appetite dictates, and of a meat that is chiefly or entirely lean. Another good way might be to go without a meal or two. For the first 3 weeks of the Russell Sage test, the outside endurance limit set by Dr. Benedict, I was watched day and night by the Institute staff. My exercise was supposed to be about that of an average businessman. I went out for walks, but always under guard. If I telephoned, the attendant stood at the door of the booth. If I went into a shop, he was never more than a few feet away, and he was always vigilant. As Dubois explained, and as I knew in advance, this was not because the staff were suspicious of me, but rather because they wanted to be able to say that they knew of their own knowledge my complete abstinence from all solids and liquids except those which I received in Bellevue, and which I ate and drank under the watch of attendants. But my affairs this year demanded that I travel widely through the United States and Canada. This was an added reason why Anderson had been secured for the experiment. When, after 3 weeks, they had to put me on a kind of parole, they retained him under lock and key, for a total of something more than 90 days. Thus, in a way, the supreme test, or at least the one best certified, was made on Anderson, and not on me. Those who had believed that a meat diet would lead to death had set at anything from 4 to 15 days the point where Dr. Lieb, as clinical supervisor, would have to call a halt in view of danger to the subjects. Even those who expected only a slow breakdown and impaired health merely had placed the appearance of the dread symptoms well before 30 days. In any case, Anderson reported back to the hospital constantly after he left it and whenever I was in town. After my 3 weeks and Anderson's 13, and with the constant analyses of excretions and blood when we came back to the hospital for checkups, the doctors felt certain they would catch us at it if we broke diet. Moreover, long before the 13 weeks ended, they had satisfied themselves that Anderson had no longing for fruits or other vegetable materials, and, therefore, no motive for breach of contract. During the early summer, toward the middle of our experiment, both of us were living in New York City and eating mainly in restaurants, though there were a few home-cooked meals. At the restaurants, we looked over the menu each time, in the way of a regular customer, and selected whatever appealed to us. Our belief was that no theory of what to select would be as safe a guide to health as our unbiased cravings. We sometimes had difficulty, however, in getting what we wanted in restaurants. I remember, for instance, a meal at the Commodore Hotel one day when I had a strong feeling that I would rather have mutton fat than bacon. I told the waiter, in words of one syllable and with pauses between them, that I wanted chops from which the fat had not been trimmed. He assured me that my chops would come just as I had ordered them, but when they came, they had been Frenched. There was scarcely a visible trace of fat. Now I called a head waiter, or captain, and was assured that next time the chops would be right. He may have given the correct orders to a waiter, but I got the same kind of Frenched chops once more. My time was up, and I had to eat bacon with those chops after all. A philosophic steward of a railway diner gave me his theory on why I had so much trouble getting the fat I ordered with my lean. He said that when a customer speaks of fat to a waiter, it is nearly always to specify that it must be removed, or, in the case of bacon, that it should be fried to a crisp. There was, he considered, at least a 25% chance that all the waiter would remember when he got back to the kitchen was that the customer had said something about fat, and naturally this would be that it should be removed. Then there was another 25% chance that, even if the waiter said the right thing, the cook would get it wrong, for he is used to no commandments on fat, except those of prohibition. Occasionally, when I was in a hotel that prided itself on serving anything that a customer wanted in the style which he desired, I would inquire whether I could get beef or other meat broth free from vegetable contamination. In most cases, this proved impossible, except on a very long wait, or an order in advance. In a few cases they tried to put over on me broth which I found on investigation really had one sort or other of vegetable taint. Our regimen permitted ordering broiled chicken in a restaurant, but not fried, because the frying might be in butter or even in olive oil. The oil would have been a major pollution of our diet, being of vegetable origin. The butter would have been only a technical infringement. For, as has been said, we were really within our rights if we ate butter. It is not directly a vegetable product, and was omitted from our diet merely because we did not want to give a foothold to those vegetarians who exempt milk and its products from their damnation. Naturally, chicken Maryland was forbidden, along with breaded chops and things of that sort. Something near to an exemption in the class of milk, milk products, and eggs was derived at by our authorities in view of my need for extensive traveling. It would happen in a small town that I had to get off a train at, say, 2 in the morning, and wait around the station till 5 or 6 for my connection. Usually there would be in the neighborhood a restaurant of the wagon type, They would have puffed rice and cornflakes and many other things that were strictly forbidden to me. There might remain only such mildly taboo things as bacon and eggs. In such cases, perhaps a dozen times during the year, and in a few analogous cases, I did eat eggs. But there were periods of several months at a time during which I did not touch an egg or anything under that classification. My colleague Anderson was immaculate. He did not have to travel and was never under the necessity, any more than he was under the inclination, of using eggs or butter. He never tasted eggs, milk, or milk products the whole year. Meals that were amusing to me and difficult for my hostess came now and then when I was invited out to dinner. I told them always that what I really preferred was just one thing to a meal: a big sirloin steak, several lamb chops with the fat on them, a dish of boiled mutton ribs, or something of that sort. I preferred the meat boiled, partly for its own taste, but largely because then I would have the hot broth for drink instead of just cold water. But I found that a plain meal of one article gave many a hostess such distress that it seemed worthwhile to devise a plan of alleviation. Finally, we arrived at a course dinner which might go something like this. Hors d'oeuvres. Caviar served on slices of white chicken breast with about the size and thickness of a 50-cent piece. Soup. Broth made by boiling meat, in some cases bone. Fish. Any kind of fish, boiled or baked. If fried, then in bacon fat. Entree. Lamb chops. Most hostesses preferred to garnish with bacon. Dessert. Gelatin, solely of meat origin and made according to a recipe which I got hold of somewhere. It seemed to please hostesses that I was permitted to drink black coffee. The permission was given by our supervising committee because there had been carried through some time before an extensive research, I think at the University of Rochester, which showed that black coffee and black tea contained no appreciable vitamin C, and those who expected our experiment to fail were counting heavily on our developing scurvy. The simple formula then current, 1928 to 1929, being that, quote, meat is deficient in the vitamin C needed to prevent scurvy. It happens, however, that I never liked coffee without sugar, which was forbidden, nor did I ever get used to saccharin. I don't think I often drank more at these formal dinners than half of a small after-dinner cup. The coffee was there primarily for the sake of my hostess. As long as they could serve it, they did not usually seem to mind whether I drank it. Both Anderson and I, on rare occasions, took advantage of the permission to use black tea, but only in restaurants, where we drank water certainly more than 90% of the time. For the summer, Anderson and I took a small house near Croton, New York, and did our own cooking. Our chief motive for home cooking was to get a mutton, beef, or chicken broth in which we had confidence, and which we liked after many years of having used caribou and seal broth in the Arctic. During those several months we lived mainly on boiled meats, including fish. A practice that amused or horrified our friends, according to their predilections, was that we ate bones. The Eskimos, from whom we had learned our meat-eating, have no theories about diet, at least none that remotely resemble ours. They chew a lot of bones of a certain kind. Other bones, which are just as chewably soft, they do not use at all. They eat the ones that taste good. The bones not chewed by Eskimos are those of the blubber-carrying sea mammals: seal, walrus, whale, polar bear. Theoreticians will say, there you are, that the Eskimos don't chew those bones because they are getting plenty of fat from the blubber direct. So far, so good. They do, certainly, get plenty of fat. We have found in traveling over the sea ice on our exploratory journeys and living entirely by hunting, Eskimo fashion, that when we kill seals enough to supply the lean desired, we necessarily secure so much fat that, after men and dogs have eaten all they want, and after we have burned all that is necessary for cooking our meals and heating our dwellings, we still have left over fully a third of the blubber. If you were to follow our trail, as polar bears sometimes do, you would find a little heap of blubber at every third and fourth campsite. Or, if you didn't, Sherlock Holmes' methods would tell you that the hunting was not going well and that we were on short rations. Perhaps the reason why the ends of bones from sea mammals do not taste particularly good is that there is little or no fat in them. But all we ever think of, and still more certainly all the Eskimos ever think of, is just that they do not taste good. The bones of the blubber mammals do not have marrow, in the sense that human or beef bones do. Apparently there is corresponding absence of fat from the cavities in the spongy ends of the bones. In the typical herbivorous animal, bone ends usually carry much fat. With sea mammals, as with those of the land, we eat cartilage when we find it if the beast is young and there is more cartilage. And in that sense, we do eat a certain amount of the bones of blubber animals. From all animals, we eat the sinew, unless it has been removed because the women need it for sewing thread. The tendon of Achilles in northern animals, from the gigantic moose down, is eaten as something of a delicacy, either cooked or raw. In neither case is it chewed. It is cut into bits that slide down easily and are swallowed one after the other, each getting just a few bites, and rolls around the tongue to cover them with saliva. These tendons have little taste, but still one feels inclined to eat them. When fat-hungry, we eat not only the soft ends of all bones of grazing mammals and birds, but the whole of each bone, which is readily chewable. About all that would not be eaten from a ptarmigan, which is a kind of quail, pigeon-looking kind of bird, all that would not be eaten from a ptarmigan would be the shafts of the long bones. The neck and backbone are particularly good if your teeth are good, and, as explained elsewhere, the teeth of all uncivilized Eskimos are always good, at least from the caries point of view. Cavities. In New York City, during the Russell Sage tests, we ate a lot of bones. We cleaned up a broiled spring chicken as completely as an Eskimo would a ptarmigan, and we selected portions of other animals at butcher shops, somewhat with reference to the chewability of the bones, which tasted as good in New York as they ever had up north. I feel sure I would have eaten practically the identical bone proportions had there been no theory, but even in the north I rationalized the desire for bones into thinking they would take the place of spinach or bran in giving bulk to the diet. It is written by many nutritionists and physiologists that Eskimos get the necessary calcium by chewing bones. Their skeletons, as studied in our museums, indicate a plentiful calcium supply, and when I first heard that their calcium was derived from bone chewing, it struck me as reasonable. There had been certainly in me no sign of calcium deficiency after 10 Arctic years, about half of which were exclusively on meat, and the other half on a preponderance of meat. I could remember, thinking back, that I had chewed a great many bones. Now I worry somewhat, fearing I may have given written adherence to the calcium from chewed bones theory, but take some comfort in the fact that I have not been able to discover this in my printed writings. I realize now a flaw in the argument, serious if not fatal to it. On the basis of the preceding discussion of the differences in flavor and anatomical structure between seal and caribou bones, it can be stated simply and flatly that the man who chews a lot of bones in a caribou hunting year will chew no bones at all in a sealing year. I have myself never gone more than, say, half a year at a time, exclusively on seal, then eating no bone, except cartilage, and perhaps, in my case, that span could have been tided over by the calcium I got from herbivorous animals during the other 6 months. But there are Eskimos who live practically exclusively on seal their whole lives, and yet there is no indication while they live that they are less healthy than the caribou eaters, nor do their skeletons show a lack of calcium. Thus, calcium deficiency is as absent from those meat-eaters who practically never eat bones as from those who eat them nearly every day of their lives. In the Arctic and in New York, we were fond of eating skin. I always eat bacon rind. I am fond of pickled pig's feet. mainly, I think, because I like the skin and tendons, for there is not much else to pig's feet, except fat. If there is any part of a fried chicken that tastes better to a meat devotee than the chewable bones, then it is the skin. The like applies to all birds, unless one has been on the verge of fat overeating, in which case the fat attached to the skin may repel him. Toward the end of the covenanted year, Anderson and I returned to Bellevue for final intensive studies of some weeks on the meat diet, studies which would then be carried through our first 3 weeks on a mixed diet. At this end of the experiment, all went smoothly with me, but not so with Anderson. My trouble, it will be remembered, had been that at the outset they stuffed me with lean. Anderson's difficulty, or at least annoyance, began on the second day after he completed a year on meat, January 25th, 1929, when they asked him to eat all the fat he could, permitting along with it only a tiny bit of lean, about 45 grams per day. There they kept him on the verge of nausea for a week. The second week they added first taste of vegetables in a year, thrice cooked cabbage, totaling about 35 grams of carbohydrate per day. The third week they omitted the cabbage and retained the high proportion of fat to lean. These 3 weeks, Anderson says, were the only difficult part of the experiment. Looking back at it now, he thinks if it were possible to separate the nausea from the other unpleasantness, there would have still been a good deal left over, that at the end of the third week he wasn't, properly speaking, well. However, that is speculation, if not imagination. Returning to facts, we have the ominous one that a pneumonia epidemic was sweeping New York. The hospital was crowded with patients. Some of the staff got the disease, and with them Anderson. It was type 2 pneumonia in his case, and the physicians were gravely worried, for this type was proving deadly in that epidemic, carrying off 50% of its Bellevue victims. Anderson, however, reacted quickly to treatment, and the disease ran an unusually short course, convalescing rapidly. The broad results of the experiment were, so far as Anderson and I could tell, and so far as the supervising physicians could tell, that we were in at least as good average health during the 12 months on exclusive meat as during 3 mixed diet weeks at the start. We thought our health had been a little better than average. We enjoyed ourselves and prospered as well on the meat in midsummer as in midwinter, and we seemed to feel no more discomfort from the heat than our fellow New Yorkers did. It is ordinary experience that when one shifts from a mixed diet to exclusive meat diet, or from meat to mixed, the appetite falls off during the first week, most pronouncedly, perhaps, between the second and fourth days. It appeared reasonable to suppose that when going from exclusive meat to foods that have a high proportion of starches and sugars, like the ordinary American meals of today, any difficulty would be connected with sugar intolerance. For this and other reasons, our ability to handle sugar had been tested while we were still on the mixed diet, before we began the year of meat. Now that the meat year was over, a corresponding test was made. We drank glucose syrup in measured large quantities, I think 1.5 pints at a time, and were then subjected to the usual tests. The first glucose meal, when we were immediately off the meat, showed a poor sugar tolerance, but in a week or so we were back to where we had been before the meat year began. In view of beliefs that remain strangely current, it is worth emphasizing that we liked our meat as fat in July as in January. This ought not to surprise Americans, though it usually does, for they know or have heard that fat pork is a staple and relished food of the Negro in the Deep South. Our Negro literature is rich with the praise of possum fat, nor did Negroes develop the taste for fats in our southern states, for Carl Akeley brought from tropical Africa such yarns of fat gorging as have not yet been surpassed from the Arctic. A frequent complaint of travelers in Spain is against foods that swim in oil, and there are similar complaints when we visit rural Latin America. In Puerto Rico, cracklings are sold like candy. So we really know, when we stop to think, that many, if not most tropical people like greasy food. I return to this topic in the chapter Living on the Fat of the Land. Parallel to, and as strange as, the current view that one does not like fat foods in hot weather is the other belief that the largest meat consumption is in cold countries. True, the 100%ers are way up north, the dog ribs, Eskimos, Ninets, Chukchis, but almost the heaviest meat eaters who speak English are the Australians, tropical and subtropical. It used to be stated with seeming authority that Australia led all English-speaking countries in meat consumption. More recently, it has been reported that the New Zealanders outdo them. New Zealand, of course, is not cold. The North Island is somewhat warmer than England, while the nearest approach to the exclusive meat diet among people of European stock is perhaps in tropical Argentina, where the cowboys live on beef. They like their meat fat, and, so an Argentinian New Yorker tells me, will threaten to quit work, or at least did 40 years ago, if you attempt to feed them in any considerable part on cereals, greens, and fruits. There are doubtless few men elsewhere, perhaps none, who will go to the extreme of the Eskimos, as I found them on the middle north coast of North America, and as others have reported them from a few of the more northerly districts, where they consider that roots and berries are not foods, but substitutes for foods, things that are eaten in foolery or in times of starvation. But it appears common, and has been found all over the world in all ages, that meat is considered the superior food, vegetables inferior or secondary. Karl Lumholtz reported, after living with the natives of tropical northern Australia, that they ate nothing vegetable if meat was on hand. In searching for material on the history of navigation, a research associate of mine was going through Hero Tales of Ireland, collected by GertMcClert, Boston, 1894, and came upon a bit that seems to indicate the traditional Irish view on the comparative suitability of diets high in meat and others high in vegetables. In the story, the Amadan Mór and the Grungach, the king of Leinster defeated and slew the king of Munster. The victor decided to live in Munster. The widow of the former king fled to the forest, where she gave birth to a child. They had no clothes, and hair grew out all over them. Eventually the queen went to the castle to beg for dole. The attendants did not think she was human. She countered, I have the look of a beast, because I eat fruits and leaves of trees and grass of the earth. This was, of course, long before the introduction of the potato. Curtin fails to give a date, but says that the stories relate to heroes and adventures of an ancient time, and contain elements peculiar to early ages of storytelling. A preference for meat foods, if not a prejudice against the others, can be traced through the history and literature of mankind in every age, climate, and country. Except for wine, which is from the kingdom of vegetables, the highest praise in Greek poetry, particularly the Homeric, is for meats. The same indication of preference runs through the Bible. What is said in Genesis 4:2-5 is considered more fully in a later chapter, that the Lord was not pleased with Cain when he brought an offering of garden produce, but was pleased when Abel brought some fat mutton. This led to the tragedy in which Cain the gardener killed Abel the shepherd, foreshadowing that bitterness which the vegetarians still feel against those who persist in the eating of sirloins and chops. A conclusion of our experiment, which the medical profession seemingly finds difficult to assimilate, but which at the same time is one of our clearest results, is that the normal meat diet, where one eats at each meal as much lean and fat as he likes, is not a high-protein diet. A casual look at the meals we ate in Bellevue might lead you to the conclusion that we were living chiefly on lean. But then you would be forgetting that in a medium or rare sirloin steak, the red meat on your plate is mostly water, while the white suet has very little water in it. Speaking in terms of calories, Dr. Lieb, the clinician of the Russell Sage tests, put it this way. Stephenson averaged about 2,650 calories a day, 2,100 calories consisting of fat and 550 of protein. Anderson averaged about 2,620 calories a day, 2,110 calories consisting of fat and 510 of protein. In another part of the same paper, Dr. Lieb says that the ratio of protein to fat in Anderson's food and mine does not make this a high-protein diet. He said elsewhere that while the protein percentage of our diet was perhaps a little above average, it was not as high as the protein ratio of a great many New York businessmen who are fond of meat and who can afford to eat as much of it as they like at their various meals. This is remembering, of course, that the said businessmen would be getting protein from a number of sources other than meat, as, for instance, from oatmeal, chocolate, baked beans, milk, and eggs. That meat, as some have contended, is a particularly stimulating food, I verified subjectively during our New York experiment. It seemed to me that I was more optimistic and energetic than ordinarily. To the best of my memory and judgment, I looked forward with more anticipation to the next day, or the next job, and was more likely to expect pleasure or success. This may have a bearing on the common report that the uncivilized Eskimos are the happiest people in the world. There have been many explanations: that an Arctic climate is invigorating, that a hunter's life is pleasant, and that the poor wretches just don't know how badly off they are. The suggestion is now added that the optimism may be in part directly caused by what they eat. Some additional, fairly precise things can be said of the way we fared during the year on meat. For instance, with Dr. Dubois as pacemaker, we used to run every few weeks around the reservoir in Central Park, and thence to his house, going up the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, sitting down on cots, and having scientific attendants register our breathing, pulse rate, and other crude reactions. These observations, when compared with others made just before the exercise, appeared to show that our stamina increased with the lengthening of the meat period. Anderson, who had suffered one head cold after another when working nearly stripped outdoors in his Florida orange grove, contracted only 2 or 3 colds during the meat year in New York, and those were light. In Florida his hair had been thinning rapidly. It seemed to him there was a marked decrease in the shedding after he went on the meat diet, but he did not regain what he had lost. As has been said, according to the reports of the doctors, Anderson was troubled when he came from Florida with certain toxin-producing intestinal microorganisms, in relation to which physicians at that time ordinarily prescribed elimination of meat from the diet. This condition did not trouble him while he was living on meat. A phase of our experiment has a relation to slimming, slenderizing, reducing, the various treatments of obesity. I was about 10 pounds overweight at the beginning of the meat diet, by life insurance standards, and lost all of it. This reminds me to say that Eskimos, when still on their home meats, are never corpulent. At least I have never seen any who were. They may be well-fleshed. Some, especially women, are notably heavier in the middle age than when young, but they are not corpulent in our sense. Eskimos in their native garments do give the impression of fat, round faces on fat, round bodies, but the roundness of face is a racial peculiarity, and the rest of the effect is produced by loose and puffy garments. If you see them stripped, one does not find the abdominal protuberances and folds which are so in evidence at Coney Island beaches, and so persuasive against nudism. There is, however, among Eskimos, no racial immunity to corpulence. That is proved by the rapidity with which, and the extent to which, they fatten on European diets. One serious fear of the group of scientists conducting our Russell Sage trials at first seemed to be realized. The measured pan of our diet for the year turned out low in calcium. This was not demonstrated by any tests upon Anderson or me, and certainly no one could have proved it by asking us or looking at us, for we felt better and looked healthier than our average for the year immediately previous. The calcium deficiency appeared solely through the analyses of the chemists. Part of the routine at Bellevue was to give the chemists, for analysis, pieces of meat as nearly as possible identical with those we ate. For instance, a lamb would be split down the middle of the spine. We got a chop from the right side to eat, while the chemists got a chop from the left side to analyze. Next they got a right chop, we a left, and so on, alternating. When the diet was sirloin, they received steaks matching ours. From these studies it was clear on paper that we were not getting enough calcium for health. But we were healthy. The first avenue of escape from that dilemma was to assume that a calcium deficiency which did not hurt us in 1 year might destroy us in 10 or 20. When a doctor looks for a calcium deficiency, he studies bones. The thing to do, then, was to examine the skeletons of people who had died at a reasonably high age after living from infancy upon an exclusive meat diet. Such skeletons are those of Eskimos who died before European influences came in. The American Meat Institute was induced to make a subsidiary appropriation to the Peabody Museum of Harvard University, where Ernest Houghton, professor of physical anthropology, undertook a thoroughgoing research on the calcium problem in relation to the museum's collection of skeletons of meat-eaters. Dr. Houghton reported no sign of calcium deficiency. On the contrary, there was every indication that the meat-eaters had been liberally, or at least adequately, supplied. They had suffered from calcium deficiency no more in a lifetime than we had in our short year. As the reader of this statement knows from what was said some pages back, there was here a possible source of error. Bones in a diet would be a patent source of calcium, and some Eskimos eat many, while others use few or none. We had not eaten them appreciably at Bellevue when our diet was being measured, for it did not occur to us to eat bones. We had no craving for them, and, at that stage, no concern about them. But when we began to do our own cooking and to eat in restaurants, the lamb ribs we boiled at home and the young broiler chickens we ate at restaurants led us naturally back to our Eskimo habit of former years, the eating of those bones that were chewable. Our technical supervisors in Bellevue did not realize this excess of bone devouring until after we left the hospital, and we did not realize the importance of telling them. When, toward the end of the experiment, the talk grew more insistent that calcium was lacking in the measured diet, it seemed best to me not to try to talk them out of their worries, but rather to encourage them to favor an independent skeletal study, the one above mentioned, which was carried out by Professor Houghton. There was, in fact, a special need for caution and precautions in the conduct of our test, and in the announcement of the results, for even men of high standing in physiology, dietetics, and medicine, who would not consciously misrepresent what had been done or the conclusions arrived at, were subconsciously so biased, so powerfully swayed by a tendency to harmonize our results with their previous beliefs, that what we had done was in fact repeatedly misstated, our conclusions misinterpreted in textbooks, professional books, and learned journals. Of the incorrect things said about my writings concerning how we had lived in the North, and about the Russell Sage tests, probably the most serious were those which first praised us and then went on something like this. Quote, Stephenson has proved, by his experience and observations while living with Eskimos, and by his and Anderson's year on an exclusively carnivorous diet at Bellevue Hospital, that you can be healthy indefinitely on an exclusive meat diet, provided you eat a large part of your food raw or underdone, and provided, further, that you eat the whole animal. In fact, my observation and experience in the North and the results of the Russell Sage tests run contrary to both of these provisos. As to the degree of cooking, it has been explained in this and previous chapters that Eskimos cook their food, on the average, more than we do, and it has been stated in this chapter that during the Bellevue year, Anderson and I ate little food that was raw or underdone, but, instead, that Anderson tended to eat his food medium done and I well done. However, my well done is not to be interpreted to mean cooked to pieces, like a New England boiled dinner. With us it meant that the heart of each piece was slightly pink, about what restaurants speak of as medium well, in relation to a sirloin. then it is significant that the northerly forest Indians, as late as when I arrived with the Dog Ribs, Lu Shou, and other northern groups in the period 1906 to 1914, still had that horror of underdone or raw meat which had given the Crees reason to apply the contemptuous term Eskimos, eaters of raw meat, to their more northerly neighbors. Since 1914, I am told, the white man's idea of how to cook steaks and roasts has made headway. When I was with them, they spoke with abhorrence of rare meats, and cooked theirs usually to what we would call medium or medium well. Except for a few weeks in summer, when they were around the trading posts, these Indians were as exclusive meat eaters as the Eskimos. It says is. I missed that typo. These Indians were as exclusive meat eaters as the Eskimos. They did, however, sometimes eat intestines that had a little vegetable matter in them, whereas the Eskimos usually, and in my experience always, gave these to the dogs. Yet these forest Indians, eating at an average meats that we would call medium done, were as free from scurvy as the Eskimos, completely free, except a few who worked for white men, ate their food, and then developed scurvy like the whites. The second proviso, that you must eat the whole beast, has, in my experience and observation, still less foundation than the first proviso, if that be possible. Both Eskimos and northern forest Indians, and whites who live with them, have a clear mental picture of each animal they butcher, dividing the carcass, then or later, so that certain parts go uniformly to the dog team, the rest to the family. These divisions of the carcass vary from one species of animal to another, but do not vary within the species, unless slightly by season. The way in which Eskimos divide, for instance, a caribou between men and dogs has been described with some detail. Here the fact is emphasized that the organ commonly spoken of as richest in vitamins, the liver, is nearly always given to the dogs, as are the sweetbreads, and, indeed, all things from the body cavity, except the heart and kidneys. The kidneys are usually given to children, somewhat as if they were candy. So far as I know, the Eskimos of northern Alaska and northwestern Canada, and the forest Indians just to the south of them, the only condition under which they ate nearly or quite the whole caribou was in time of famine. Ceasing to give the dogs the parts which normally are theirs, was that stage of a famine which immediately preceded the killing and eating of the dogs themselves. So far as present knowledge goes, there is in ordinary red meat, or in ordinary fresh fish, without the eating of anything from the body cavity, enough vitamin C, or whatever it is that prevents scurvy, to maintain optimum health indefinitely, with its cooking to the degree which we would call medium. Certainly this is true if the meat is cooked in large chunks, as with both Eskimos and northern forest Indians, rather than in thin slices, which latter style of cooking may, for all I know, decrease the potency of the scurvy-preventing factor. There is no intention to deny, of course, that cooking to medium will somewhat lessen the meat's anti-scorbutic value. Anti-scorbutic is a fancy word for anti-scurvy. And if you don't know what scurvy is, in later chapters they'll describe it very, very vividly. What is to be said is only that even with medium cooking, there appears to be left over, in fresh red meat or fresh fish, an abundance, if not a superabundance, of all the vitamins and of all the other factors necessary for keeping a man in top form indefinitely. If results contrary to this are obtained from experiments on guinea pigs, rats, or chimpanzees, then it may be advisable to restrict the conclusions in each case to the animal from which these results were drawn. Well, that was a long chapter. I think I'll edit this video someday to fix the part about coffee, but really all you missed is that coffee doesn't have anything that cures scurvy, and that's why they didn't care if they drank coffee. But it's an abrupt, I feel bad because there's an abrupt transition between coffee and then somehow it gets to talking about fat from seals. And so I think I missed a little bit about that too. But really, you got 95% of that chapter, or 98. Anyway, next chapter is really good, fascinating, really. Chapter 5, and visit your dentist twice a year. Talks about teeth, dental health, and how people who don't eat plants don't get cavities. Basically, fascinating, if you ask me. I mean, ever since I've been living a mostly meat diet, meat and other animal products, I haven't had any tooth problems. I used to have a lot. So, if you have problems with your teeth, sick of going to the dentist, sick of getting cavities, sick of getting fillings, sick of drilling, all that, next chapter is for you. And actually, it doesn't matter how often you brush your... Well, I don't know why I'm telling you everything that's in the next chapter, but yeah, it doesn't matter if you brush your teeth or not. It has nothing to do with that. It's good to brush your teeth so that they're not filthy and ugly and your mouth isn't smelly, but it doesn't affect cavities, actually, because the Eskimos never brush their teeth. All right, catch you in the next chapter.